Let's take just a minute to consider the big U.S. tour the Stones did in 1972 after the release of Exile on Main Street. And it'll also give us a chance to have a look at not only an overview of their touring schedule as we have been studying it over these past weeks, but also we'll take a quick look at some of what's been happening with them in recording locations over this time, just to kind of get, as we get toward the end of the class, I want to really try to a certain extent, move back from the trees and see if we can get a better picture of the forest, right? We've been looking at a lot of things in sometimes very, very fine detail. Now we want to start sort of stepping back and making sense of all this detail and see how all of it lines up to create a broader kind of picture. So here's a little bit of detail about the 72 U.S. tour. It was the Stones' 7th U.S. tour, and it took place during June and July of 1972. Not too long after they finished that tour in 1972, they went off to begin work on the album Goat's Head Soup, and this time they're recording in Jamaica from November through December of 1972. Let's see how that 72 tour fits in with the history of Stones touring. Now, as you see these images come up on your screen of these tours, let me tell you a little bit about how I put this list together. My idea was to try to create a kind of a picture of what Stones touring looks like in this period between, Stones gigs look like between 62 and 72, and maybe a little bit forward from that. I've chosen to focus on the US tours since those were the biggest of the big tours, the biggest crowds, the biggest revenues, the most dates in many cases. But I've also tried to fill in some of the other things that they were doing to kind of give you a sense of where their overall sort of their concert and live gig situation is like. So we start from July the 12th, 1962. Remember, that's the first gig at the Marquee Club. After doing gigs, you know, as we talked about, there was the gig at the Crawdaddy Club and various kinds of things. The first real British tour they took place in September, November of 1963. By the time we get to April and May of 1964, they're already on their 4th British tour. So they've done 4 British tours. Remember, by the time we get to 1964, as we've said a couple of times in this class, more than a couple actually, the group is really big in the UK. They're doing these tours. We're starting to get all this kind of, you know, the riots and all that kind of thing that goes on. But then comes, in June of 1964, that first American tour. And by now, we all know the story of that first American tour. A couple of good gigs, but mostly it was a disappointment. But the Stones came back. In fall of that year, October, November 1964, for their second American tour. And then you see April, May of 1965, the third American tour. Well, it's, of course, in the summer of 1965 that I Can't Get No Satisfaction is released in the U.S. and becomes their breakout #1 hit. So by the time we get to the 4th American tour of October, December of 1965, the Rolling Stones are clearly a top international rock act. And then we get to the 5th American tour of June, July 1966. That's the last American tour. That's, I mean, all of these tours, including the 8th British tour from September, October 1966, and a European tour of March, April 1967. They're all really, I've grouped them all together here, as really being the same kind of tour experience. They're playing a relatively short set. We're talking about 25 or 30 minutes maybe, if they're able to get through all of it. Remember, there's the joke about the guys taking bets backstage about how far they'd be able to get into the set before the police shut them down, right? But we're talking about very short sets. We're talking about relatively unsophisticated performance equipment, you know, guitar, you know, single guitar amps, you know, just turned all the way up, and PA systems, vocal support that isn't, you know, really very sophisticated, this kind of thing. That's one era of their touring. And then you'll see between that European tour of March, April 1967 and the 6th American tour of November, December 1969. See, there's a very big gap there. It's over 2 years worth of gap. And as we talked about before, in that time, after the Stones were off the road, not doing those sort of 30-minute set things anymore, and the time when they came back on the road, the touring business had changed. First of all, it was not so much teeny boppers anymore. It was more like college-age kids. They expected a concert, and groups were infrequently stopped. the group played all the way through a set, and the set had to be of some substantial length, probably at least 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. You know, we talk about stories of like groups like Led Zeppelin playing 3 or 4 hour shows in those early days, 1969, 1970. So we're talking about an entirely different thing than running on with a couple of small guitar amps and playing Until the Police Stop You after 2 or 3 songs, right? Very different kind of world, and that's what's happening in 1969. That's captured in the video Gimme Shelter, which I've talked about a couple of times here, and that's the tour on which that ends with that Altamont incident and the tragedy from that. We then see in August through October of 1970 a European tour, and then in March of 1971 a Goodbye Britain tour. But look how much the touring has slowed down. We talked about how the singles were slowing down and the album production was slowing down. Now the touring, the pace of the business is beginning to change. It's no longer the same kind of very quickly moving, almost focused on immediate gratification business of the middle 60s. Now people are taking more time with the music, not only to listen to it, but also to make it and to create it. And then we get to the seventh American tour, June, July of 1972. That's the one we're talking about this week, and that's the one that's captured on the video, Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones, the tour they do in support of Exile on Main Street. When you look at those two groups of tours together, you see in the first half of the group's career between 62 and 67, a lot of tours and a lot of dates clustered together very closely. And then you look at the period between 1969 and 1972 and you see 2 American tours and a couple of other tours in between there. So you can see things have changed very much. And that gives us a kind of overview of how things are developing in the career of the Rolling Stones. Another kind of fun thing to do is to have a look at the studios, because at the very beginning of the course, I made a big deal about how, since the Rolling Stones recording deal was different, by virtue of them not signing directly to Decca, but by licensing the recordings, they were not forced to record in the Decca studios. For example, the Beatles, as we've mentioned, were signed to EMI, Parlophone. They had to record in those Abbey Road studios. It's become an iconic studio, but the Beatles a lot of times would have preferred to record someplace like Olympic or RCA if they could have, but they couldn't. That wasn't the deal they had, and so they're very different. So now we get to this point, we can look back and see, well, gosh, how many different studios did these guys record in? Well, I haven't even listed them all here. I've just listed the ones that are the primary ones to kind of show a kind of a migratory pattern of recording behavior, right? So we start out 1963 to 1964. The majority of the sessions are at Regent Studios in London. Remember, that's that small studio that they liked. It wasn't the most sophisticated one, but they just kind of liked the vibe of that studio, and they used it an awful lot during those early years. There were those 2 visits when they were in the United States, the Chess Studios in 1964 and 1965 that produced a lot of sessions that they used. And then there was a stint at the RCA studios in 1965 through 1966. And we spent a lot of time talking about in Los Angeles, and how that in late 1966 recording began to go more and more back to Olympic, where they would do the recording, but they would still come to LA to mix and finish an album, but they would just get the tracks recorded in Olympic, much more convenient for them. That Olympic period really comes and goes throughout their career up to the point we're talking about, but is mostly concentrated in the 1966 to 1970 period. The other sort of things that are worth noting here is that they visit the Muscle Shoals Sound Studios in Alabama in 1969, and they do some recording at Mix House, Stargroves in 1970. That's when the story about the Rolling Stones mobile unit and the idea of being able to record at somebody's house starts to come up. Well, of course, that's very handy for 1971 because so much of that album was recorded in France at Keith's place using that mobile studio. And then in late 1972, as I mentioned before, going a little bit farther than what we're talking about this week, they end up at Dynamic Sound Studios in Kingston, Jamaica. And then in late 1973 through 1975, they do a significant amount of recording at Musicland Studios in Munich, Germany. So when you look at this period over 1963 through about 1965, you really see the Stones moving through a number of different studios, and with that there are different engineers and different kinds of things going on. So having taken a look at the overall kind of touring picture for the Stones over the course of the period we're studying here together, and also having taken a review of the recording studios that they use. Let's now return to our song close-ups. We've got 3 more songs to look at. at from sides 3 and 4 of Exile on Main Street, Happy, All Down the Line, and Shine a Light.